Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Of Record podcast. Last week you had Matt no Joe. Now you have Joe no Matt. So eventually we will both be on the same podcast here in the near future. So I think the stories of the week are going to be pretty clear to anyone listening. Specifically, we have the protest and we have the riots going on. But what I want to actually focus on is you could think of them as the digital media systematic questions that are surfacing as a result of this. And we'll jump through a few stories and background, and then I'll talk about some of my thoughts on what's happening in our overall media ecosystem right now. And then I'll end with a little bit of a deep dive on the Joe Rogan deal with Spotify, which feels like that was an eon ago. But I think it ties in a little bit to this concept of where the whole ecosystem is headed. So the first thing that happened last week that kicks this off is Donald Trump made a tweet and he used a phrase when the looting starts, comma, the shooting starts, period. Which, whether it was intentionally vague or a dog whistle or whatever, is probably beyond our topic here. What's important is how Twitter handled that tweet. And the way Twitter handled that tweet was they fact check it, right, Nipa? That's what they did. They put the little factual, actually, or the glorifying violence
Yeah,
thing on
they
there.
said something about glorifying violence. Yeah.
Yeah. So that then triggers the White House into getting the FCC involved and asking for a review of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Now, we've talked about Section 230 a couple of times before in reference to a lawsuit that was going on in California between Prager University, the conservative video education YouTube channel, and Google. Effectively, and this is an overgeneralization, but it'll suit for our purposes, Section 230 says there can be a publisher or a platform. And a publisher, because they're exercising editorial control, is liable for things that happen on their in their
Medium
publication, I guess,
publication.
media.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this would be when you think of traditional media. So Washington Post, New York Times, your local paper, CNBC, CNN, those would be the Section 230 publisher types. Then you have the platform types. And so your platform types, and this, by the way, also applies to, say, AT&T or Verizon, where you can think of it as they have pipes. They're neutral on what goes through the pipes, and they're not liable if, say, someone plans a terrorist attack using AT&T phones. But this also has been applied to the social media network specifically, so Facebook and Twitter and Google, where because they're a platform, as long as they are agnostic about what goes on there, except for a limited array of things, I think it's lewd and lascivious stuff or federal crimes or trademark infringement, they're not liable for it. So as you know, because we've talked about this previously, the catch-22 for the platforms is the pressure to remove and edit and review makes them act a lot like a publisher, combined with the perceived activism of their executives and employees. It makes them feel a lot more like a publisher. And so you have this tension between this free and open platform, as they're currently regulated, and then a publisher, which is how the president is saying he wants the FCC to look into regulating them, specifically in terms of political speech. Did you have something you want to say on that, Nipa? I saw you look at the camera.
I'm still processing this
Um,
whole thing.
yeah, so I'll keep going through the story here, and then we'll kind of circle back up on what it means for the whole digital and really media ecosystem. So Facebook reviews the same content, and Facebook says, it meets our standards. We don't like it, but it meets our standards. Facebook allows it to be posted. as a result, there was a Facebook employee walkout. Some of Facebook's senior staff quit. And then civil rights leaders were not happy after a call with Mark Zuckerberg and his explanation for why they allowed the content to remain on the page. So the week goes on. It's been a long week. By the way, I was off last week, and the difference between when I left 2 Fridays ago and when I came back, it was like a completely
It's a
different world.
huge difference, yeah.
So as we go through the week, what happens is there starts to be, the protests start to unfold. At night, they get violent. Twitter and Facebook start to light up with, hey, Antifa will give you a ride into this neighborhood if you want to come ride in this neighborhood. And there's rumors that some of these groups are coordinating over an app called Signal, which is an encrypted app. And you have governors, saying that they are organizing on the dark web, and we need to do something about these communications on the dark web. And then the major papers start to write op-eds and articles. The one I have pulled up now, the Washington Post: disinformation is flourishing amid the unrest. It's crucial to root out the distortions. So what I think we have is the whole Section 230 debate, which the president has brought up, coming to a very clear head right now in what's going to happen in the world of big tech and social media. Your right to post and speak on those platforms, the platform's right to sell ads against that stuff, the government's ability to regulate it. These are all what's going on in the invisible airways over top of the protest and the looting and the riots, and the good and the bad right now is this question, which when it's resolved, will have long-term impacts and consequences on how we use the internet, and the internet has a free and open platform or not. Nipa, do you think that was a pretty good review of the situation and the media ecosystem right now? Anything I missed that you think should be covered there?
No, I think that's a pretty good review. That op-ed you mentioned also kind of asks for a call to action from the platforms to actually step in and point out if things are true or untrue. So this op-ed is actually pointing out that this information is being spread through a variety of platforms, and it is the responsibility of the platforms to mitigate that.
Correct. So the Washington Post is basically taking a strong stance on how the platform should behave in regards to Section 230. So, and that kind of ties into the next piece of the whole issue that I wanted to go over, and kind of at a meta level, what's going on in that environment right now. And this has been going on now for 4 years. So, and I promise we'll get to some hot takes on this issue, but I want to make sure everybody listening has a good, at least a bottom baseline understanding of the environment as it stands. So when you think of, say, the Washington Post, the New York Times, LA Times, Fox News, CNBC, MSNBC, what people call, the mainstream media or the broadcast media, or whatever term you prefer to use, the thing you have to keep in mind about all of these is they are supported entirely or significantly by ad revenues from advertisers. Over the last 10 years, what's happened is their competitors went from being other publications or other, say, TV news competitors or other newspaper competitors, to being the big tech companies, specifically Facebook and Google. In fact, Facebook and Google primarily. So as they grew, the media has kind of fallen in terms of their ability to generate revenue off of advertising. So one of the aspects that you have here is you have dueling corporations, mostly an East Coast centric, New York, DC, traditional media complex, and a West Coast centric, Seattle, San Francisco, LA, digital media, big tech complex. They are effectively in a fight for who controls the ad dollars from American corporations going forward. So neither side, it's a mistake to think either side has the public interest at its heart. Both sides, and they may believe, right? Like I don't know what's in the soul of the people writing the op-eds. They may very well believe what is also in their financial interests, as people often do. But they also have an objective to try and cripple the other side's ability to generate revenue off the advertisers they need to get. And so that might be attacking their reputation. That might be pointing out flaws in their business models. That might be attacking their executives. That might be pointing out, types of ads that can be run that may have creepy targeting, or we don't like the way that they're targeted. So that's what's going on at the first level. The second level that's going on there is exactly what this is saying. All of the traditional media are regulated under Section 230 as publishers, and they have the restrictions that are placed on publishers in terms of what they can say and what they cannot say and what they're liable for. And they would also probably like to get their major competitors pulled in to that piece of the regulatory world. So then you move down. Now you actually have the, what is the social and public concern over. I didn't put on my do not disturb before we started here. It always happens. There's everything I listen to now. There's always dinging that's happening in the background.
Yes.
The public concern of how much should we trust individuals to make judgments about the validity and impact of the information that they see on a regular basis. And so that is the philosophical question that is being posed to everybody right now. So Nipa, anything you'd want to add on the kind of the key questions, summary there?
I don't think so. I think that that's a pretty good summary. I think that it is so much more, it's still a lot more complicated than that, but that is also a very good broken down version.
Yeah, and look, it's complicated, but at the end of the day, when legal decisions are made, it'll be made on very specific questions, and based on specific philosophy. And look, the philosophies, the way they break down, by the way, isn't very clear how this aligns in terms of American politics. So right now we have conservatives arguing that businesses should be regulated more strictly, which is an unusual conservative position to take on a market. We have people on the left are arguing that the social media companies should take direct publishing actions, so that they should be affirmatively taking an action to police the platform, which, on the left is, so traditionally the history of the internet over, say, the past 30 years has been people on the left standing up in favor of the values of a free and open internet, has something where people who are marginalized in general society could have a voice independent of anything that would cause them in physical life to be discriminated, because you can be anonymous, you can pick your photo, your work can be judged for your work on the internet independent of who you are. And so that was the stance on the left for a long time, was free and open internet. And this is why the theory goes that San Francisco, Silicon Valley, I would use the notoriously progressive area of the country, that the tech community grew so rapidly there. This idea of free thought, open expression, and that was the way the internet was going to go. And in recent years, that's been pulled back on. So
there's always people who ruin it for everyone.
There is always people who ruin it for everyone. That seems to be a theme of the week. So what I want to take that setup to is my thinking on, so what I will argue, and this has been my stance on the internet for my entire career that I've been, working in it, is the danger of interference in free and open communication on the internet vastly exceeds or is vastly less than the danger of the government deciding what speech meets standard, or by proxy putting in rules and regulation that pressures the companies that host that content into taking a stance on speech. And look, I'm not an extremist on that. Like, sure, take off the lewd and lascivious, the stuff that violates copyright, that's fine. Well, I think we get into a dangerous place when we start to put in rules that regulate speech today, because that speech in 2 years may be completely different in meaning and in value based on what's going on in the country or the world. Secondarily to that, another thing that's going on that I don't like, and I've heard this term used by multiple government officials on both the left and right, is basically arguing that the rioters are organizing on, quote, the dark web, end quote. But then they'll reference, apps like Signal, which you can just download on the App Store, which is encrypted. And so I worry also that aside from this, there's a push not only to regulate the major platforms more heavily, but also to fence off the internet to anything that isn't those major regulated platforms. So if you're not on Facebook or Google or Twitter, if you go to something else and you're off the reservation on the internet, then you must de facto be up to no good. And like, that scares me as well, because it stifles innovation. It prevents the internet from moving forward. And it also deeply impacts, people's ability to communicate and organize. And everybody cares about both of those things.
I am really surprised that Trump is the one who's been pushing the FCC to look into this, only because I think that of all things, it would impact him most heavily with what he posts all the time. But I can see where you're going. I think that it definitely could, it's a slippery slope. I mean, we've seen it already. A few people can ruin it for everyone. And these smaller platforms that are being used for planning these protests, planning these events, can get completely eradicated by more regulation, for sure. I feel like Facebook and Twitter are bigger than that at this point. I don't know. I mean, so many people get their news, and Twitter even is a lot smaller than Facebook. Let's talk about Facebook, right? Facebook is huge.
About 80% of the American adult population is on Facebook or Instagram.
Right. And so many people get their news from there and don't look twice. Don't think critically about it. Don't look at other sources. Don't see if it's true. They don't research it beyond what they see on Facebook. And even then, they might just read the headline. They may not even read the article. And I feel like I don't know, there needs to be some sort of responsibility there, but I'm not really sure what level of regulation would be needed for that.
So, I just made my, concern about that, pretty clear. One of the things that I think happens is I think we overestimate the impact of social media content on society in aggregate, because I think we have this feedback loop that exists, and it works like this. We have 3 24-hour news networks dedicated 80% to politics, maybe 90% to politics. We have a handful of national newspapers who compete online and therefore are de facto 24-hour news networks. They got to post an update all the time, get clicks. So what happens, the mental model I use to think through this is, a story happens, it surfaces on the internet, right? There's something trending on the internet. They need something to talk about. So they pluck that one thing from the internet. And then they start to cover, write. It's getting clicks, it's getting clicks. There's different angles they're pulling in on. And then what typically happens on the internet, the internet tends to disperse and diffuse. It is very hard to keep momentum on the internet for anything. Think about all of your favorite memes. They come and go so quickly in a given year. You can probably think of 20 meme trends that came and went over that period of time. And it's because our attention spans on the internet are really limited. There's always something new, always something interesting. And those platforms are encouraged to give you the new interesting thing. Otherwise, you'll just wander off. What happens once one piece gets picked out from the internet and it gets pulled into traditional media has a different business model. So what traditional media is going to do is they're going to take it and they can hold that message for a long period of time. So when Fox News decides it's going to cover something, it can keep its foot on the gas pedal for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days a week and force the issue. This is called agenda setting in media and communication theory. They still set the agenda on what people are thinking about. So now they set the agenda. People are thinking about this. They're generating their own clips and hot takes. And then that feeds back into the internet for another cycle. So what I think you have is the internet on its own would bring something up. People would get riled up about it and it would be diffused a couple days later because your newsfeed would pop something new in and you would be off down another rabbit hole. If it was just the traditional media, they would be remarkably limited on the number of stories that they could go get and tell you, because like they would actually have to go out on the street and source a story or develop people who are going to send them a hot tip to the newsroom and go cover it. So it'd be much harder to find stories to cover. In fact, 24-hour news pre-existed the internet, but the internet put 24-hour news on steroids. So you have these two systems that work independently of each other, but they rile each other up to such a degree that creates an element of radicalization in American society. And I've talked about this before in speeches and lectures I've given, that I do think we're in a radicalization cycle in the United States because one thing happens and then it's repeated 1,000 times, 10,000 times. So, look, just think about, what's recently happened with George Floyd. How many times has that video been shown? Right. And look, that video is hard to watch. And so you have this inciting element. I mean, our brains aren't evolved to live in a modern media world. Our brains are evolved for, the Serengeti. Right. And so when you keep showing this, violent thing over and over and over and over and over again, it has a programming effect. It changes the chemistry of our brains. And now in the old media days with Walter Cronkite, he'd be on 30 minutes a night. And so they may show that video to you once or twice. And then, they would start to cover other elements. In the world we live in now, I've seen the video 10 to 15 times. Nipa, how many times do you think you've seen the video or stills from the video at this point?
Many. I haven't actually been able to watch it. Full confession. I can't. It's too hard. I've seen stills of it everywhere though.
Yeah.
Probably dozens and hundreds of times at this point.
Yeah. And so we have this media system that is pumping this inciting element into everybody's brain until you get, what we have now. And then it's a feedback loop, right? So you have the initial video that comes out. The video gets repeated. People get riled up. People take to the streets and protest. The protests get out of control. And now there's a video of someone rioting and looting a store. And now, what are people seeing 24/7? The rioting and the looting, right? And so now there's infinite images of people just getting the living crap beat out of them. Again, violence, like being portrayed pretty graphically on every news network across, social media as they bounce these things back and forth in an amplifying feedback loop, which incites the next night and the next night and the next night. And look, I think, we're recording this on, Wednesday. And it looks like last night was fairly calm. But remember, in order for these cities to be calm, they had to have 4,000 and 5,000 police officers and guardsmen in the cities to make sure that nothing bad happens. So to say they are peaceful is a little bit of a overstatement on what's actually going on right now. Right now, the good thing is like the longer we go with no new videos of something bad happening to somebody, the more things calm down. But every night someone gets beaten or a store gets looted, or, you know, there's a, you know, police rough somebody up, or there's protesters throwing at police, those visuals get repeated and that amplifies the next night.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
that
I
is
think
my operating thesis on what's happening.
I think the bigger deterrent probably last night was the curfews that every city has been mandating at this point. I feel like the escalation is happening on both sides. It's happening on all sides. I mean, so
Yep.
it's hard to know where you start with peaceful protesting and it escalates.
And that's the radicalization cycle, Nipa, is the radicalization cycle needs two sides to feed off of, right? You have to have, you know, one side does something wrong, the other side sees it, the media pumps it up, literally is like pumping it into people's brains. And then you have the people on each side who day by day are the most, look, it starts with the people usually in these things. And this is what we were seeing, say 2016 to, you know, 6 months ago, is it's the people who are already having mental health issues and they're watching 10 hours a day of news or 10 hours a day of crazy things on the internet, and it breaks them. And then they go out and they shoot something up. Right. And so, and then the video of them shooting something up, the other side sees it and is like, that's an attack on people like me. Like somebody needs to do something. And so we have this radicalization cycle that kind of ping pongs back and forth. But every time that we move through that cycle, more and more people on each side are radicalized. And one of the things you can see is how few people it takes to be in a radicalized position one way or the other to throw things off. You know, maybe it's only in a group of 10,000 people, it may only take 20 to really set things off. Anything else you think we should, you know, we should cover on that? I just wanted to share the model of how I think through, you know, what's going on in media, how that impacts people, which is probably, you could describe, it's super Orwellian. I think the more you're exposed, we always have when we're kids, like we always think like, oh, the Soviets program you by like holding your eyelids open and making you watch crazy stuff. That's what's going on now.
So my thought with that is that to break that, like you've also mentioned in various conversations we've had, that the negative information usually stands out more significantly with people than positive. We talk about it with political ads. We talk about it with any kind of information. Negative things usually stand out more. So when you have someone posting something like that's inciting violence like that, but then you have Twitter calling out, well, this is inciting violence, I wonder how much pause that gives to break that radicalization cycle. If you see that,
yeah,
does it cause you to pause and think like, oh yeah, this is causing me to feel this way, and be more
self-aware? So what I think happens is because Twitter is not a trusted entity, like no one sees Twitter has like a neutral referee on it, right? They see Twitter has, you know, deeply biased to the left and anti-Trump. And so read is, oh, this is a referee saying, all right, you went out of bounds. Like this is you know, this is somebody who's on the other side, you know, trying to score a point. So I agree that should happen. Like, you know, maybe 40 years ago when the media did that, people are like, all right, yeah, that's probably out of bounds. I'll take their word for it. But that's not what's happening currently, because I don't think we have any institutions that are universally trusted to referee things.
Yeah,
I don't think we have a single one.
Yeah, we were Jeremy, my husband, and I were talking about Walter Cronkite actually, and you mentioned him, and he was one of those last like fully trusted news anchors that when he said something, you thought it was true and you believed him and you believed everything he said. And I feel like there's a huge responsibility that comes with that. If he had said something false, it, you know, usually backfired on him. He was usually called out in some way. And I don't know that we have those checks and balances anymore.
Yeah. So they were playing a different game back then too, right? And you might remember this from like, you know, when we were younger, like kids, like the news would compete over like, you know, the accurate, like the most reliable news, the most accurate news. And so networks were competing to be the most accurate, and then secondarily to be, maybe the first to break the story. We've shifted from that. News networks are no longer competing over being accurate. They do compete over being first, and then they compete over who holds attention the longest. Because Walter Cronkite only needed to hold your attention for 30 minutes a night to make his paycheck. When you look at what's going on in cable news now, they got to hold your attention for a lot longer. And they have to do it in a world where they just can't tell you what's happened because you're already aware of what's happened, from Twitter or from the news feed on your app. Now, Nipa, where I do think this is going, and I think what we're headed for is a social media blackout if things continue. And the way I see this playing out is the traditional media picks up on the narrative that social media is driving radicalization. There comes this idea of we need a cooling off period. These social media companies, big tech, get pressured into doing a blackout on political content or by new posts from anybody who's not a check mark, a verified account for a set number of days. So I think that's where we're headed, is for some sort of blackout on social media where you're just not allowed to see anything, you're not allowed to post, or only certain people are allowed to post.
I wonder how that would affect, because both of those companies, if you're thinking about Google and Facebook and Twitter for that matter, Instagram, they're all international. How does that impact other countries?
They could just do it in the United States, right? They know where their users are. And so, because they have different political rules for each country too, that they enforce. So it's doable. And that's where I wonder if we're not headed there.
Yeah, maybe. It's hard to, it's hard. Like, you look at stuff on social media right now and there's so much information. It's overwhelming, and it might actually do everyone some good to take a pause from that.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I can't tell which one of us is lagging. So I'm sure we'll be back on this topic next week. I don't think we're going to have a miraculous conclusion to all of this. But I want to finish with some quick thoughts on the Joe Rogan licensing deal with Spotify. Joe Rogan he's the equivalent of Oprah for men. The same impact Oprah had on culture in the late 90s, early 2000s among women is what Joe Rogan effectively has now on men. So Spotify a week and a half ago announced that they had acquired a licensing deal, or came to a licensing deal with Joe Rogan, rumored to be at $100 million for 3 years. So that's a lot of money. Why would Spotify pay $100 million for a comedian's interview podcast? The answer to that is Spotify's business model. And Spotify's business model is you stream a song and Spotify pays the record label for that song. So every time Spotify gets a new user and streams more songs, Spotify's cost increase. For podcasts, Spotify doesn't have that problem because every time you stream a podcast, Spotify pays nothing. Every hour of podcast you listen to costs no more, no less than if you listen to 1 minute or 10 hours of podcast. If they own those podcasts, it's even more attractive because they can sell ads exclusively against that podcasting content. Secondly, for Spotify, is they're the only player in the game that can programmatically sell targeted digital ads against podcast. The way the podcasting world works is when you're on your Apple Podcast app, or you're on the Google Podcast app, that's really just a list of RSS feeds. They're not hosting the podcast themselves. So they don't know exactly who's listening, how long they're listening. They can't inject ads into it. My opinion is Apple has missed such a big movement on this content. They spent so much money and time trying to get music where they're, a kind of a second-rate player at this point, that they missed the boat on the thing they owned from the beginning, the podcast, which is literally named after one of their products, the iPod. So, that is Spotify's angle. Why would Joe Rogan sell besides $100 million? So the rumor on Joe Rogan is the simultaneous Alex Jones ban a year and a half ago, where Apple, Google, and Facebook all announced they were pulling Alex Jones content on the same day, scared Rogan, because a big part of his listenership is actually a viewership on YouTube. And then the the Apple podcast app is his biggest source of downloads. And, I think we're talking 120 million downloads a month. And so there are more listens to Joe Rogan than there are views in a given month on 60 Minutes. He's the most important interviewer in modern history, as far as, you would think of a media interviewer like, Barbara Walters was in the 90s. So Rogan's concern is he never can know when he's going to get demonetized for something on Google. And he's worried that if one thing happens, he might be pulled off the Apple Podcast app. So for him, moving to Spotify, and by the way, Spotify is also taking the full-length videos off of YouTube and moving them onto Spotify. So for Rogan, it is safe, secure money. And because Spotify is privately held, it is more insulated against public pressure on anything that happens. This is very similar to the Howard Stern deal 15 years ago with SiriusXM, when Howard Stern moved from broadcast radio to Sirius. So what about the listener? And I think this is a couple of things happen. I think both listeners and creators in the long term get screwed by Spotify's dominance in the podcast space. It's because of this. Eventually what will happen is moving to Spotify will be a great deal for any podcaster, because just like your YouTube channel, you can post stuff and then they just pay you money. They've built all the back end to target ads and collect money, and they just pass it along to you. But what happens is over time, Spotify owns the podcaster's audience. They can't leave and go somewhere else and take that audience because it's kind of baked in onto Spotify. And what will happen is Spotify will slowly start to increase their share of the ad revenue against what the creator takes. And very slowly, the creators will get squeezed out of the amount of money they're taking, until there's just barely enough to make it worth doing, which it'll cause that format podcast to kind of mature and wither. And then, the next thing will surface in 5 or 8 or 10 years or whatever. So I actually think Joe Rogan's deal is probably the end of the golden age of podcasting. We probably have a few more coast years as people move into Spotify and make money and figure out how that works. Eventually Spotify will just take all the profits.
Oh, that's depressing.
Yeah. Look, unless Apple gets its things together and, makes something where there's a competitor there. This is the problem with YouTube, right? There's not a clear competitor to YouTube. If you want to have a video channel, where else do you go to make that where you can find audience? Yeah, not a lot of places you can go. So.
Well, we're running out of time. So
yes, we are.
Do we want to, any closing thoughts?
I think I gave a lot of thoughts on this one, so we can go without my closer. We'll be back next week. We should have Matt and I, and we'll probably revisit some of the segments from the first part of the show, as I'm sure there will be more news that's happened in the meantime. And hey, maybe some news that doesn't involve death and protesting and rioting and looting. Maybe just some regular social media news. But we'll see. This is 2020. We don't know what could happen.
Everything is, it's like we're burning everything down so that it can be rebuilt from scratch.
So the murder hornets can live in it.
Yes. Everyone forgot about the murder hornets.
Yeah. For now.
True. So yes, we'll be back next week. Check us out on our website and subscribe when you can. And we'll be back with Matt and Joe next week. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, everyone.